Who are the people in your organization who have more power than others do? Power differences are a typical feature of group life. Recognizing them is an important first step to managing these power differences so that people don't abuse their power, and so that those with minimal power have the opportunity to exert influence in an appropriate way. My assumption here is that in many groups, it's helpful to even out the playing field so that everyone's voices carry some weight. Yet I also recognize that in some situations, certain voices need to carry more weight than the voices of others. So during Crossroads' refocusing process, who exercised power? The church board obviously exerted considerable influence. They recommended the refocusing process to the congregation, along with an external facilitator to guide the process. They put forth names for the refocusing team who would work closely with the facilitator. The board determined who was on the invitation list for the personal refocusing part of the process. Once the refocusing team was in place, the board had less influence on the process as the refocusing team was intended to work somewhat independently of the board, although an elder and pastor on the refocusing team helped to ensure that communication lines between the board and the refocusing team remained open. Having said that, the board still had to approve major decisions and to intervene in some of the conflict situations that were boiling over in the church. Because the board tilted toward a more progressive orientation, it would seem that they often made decisions in keeping with that leaning. So the board, as a privileged group, used its power throughout refocusing. It was also apparent that some individual board members had a high degree of personal power, related in part to their standing as board members, but also because of other factors, such as relational connectedness, longevity in the church, and a perceived commitment to the church's well-being. The younger board members, who tended to be more progressive in their thinking, appeared to have more influence among those who participated in the refocusing summits, probably because many with traditional leanings opted out of those sessions. Ray, the refocusing facilitator, also exercised power during refocusing. It didn't take Ray long to build credibility and trust with many of us at Crossroads. How did he manage to work his way into our hearts so quickly? He demonstrated competence, genuine interest in the church. He had a concern for people's perspectives. He was a man of integrity. He showed transparency and was perceptive. He had biblical understanding and seemed to be impartial. These qualities, along with his outspokenness and positional authority, gave him standing with at least some people in the church. These qualities helped him to gain people's trust, even though he did not have longevity at Crossroads. So how did Ray influence the refocusing process? On a personal level, he had considerable sway with the refocusing team, the church board, and the church staff. We were in a desperate situation and perceived Ray as a caring expert who could help us navigate through this mess. Even though Ray customized a process he had used with many other churches, it was still a process embedded with values and biases that, to a large degree, we had to follow. For example, even though the refocusing team would discuss the summit schedules, Ray facilitated those summits. He would even craft the summit summaries, which the refocusing team would affirm that went out to the congregation. Now, I'm not saying that Ray's approach wasn't helpful. I'm just showing that he influenced the process in a major way. Throughout refocusing, it was also apparent that certain vocal people exerted influence. As one refocusing participant said, "The most vocal people are the most influential people." Another participant said, "The most passionate people will certainly bring things up and steer a conversation in that direction." Who are the vocal people in your organization or ministry or department within the larger organization who exert considerable influence? Obviously, vocal people may have some important ideas to contribute, and yet sometimes we need to help them channel their outspokenness in ways that help others contribute, particularly those who are less likely to speak out. Another group that exercised power during refocusing was those who instilled confidence in others. One participant described this group as being trustworthy because of their long-standing relationships and their selfless contribution over the years. When they would speak, people would have to acknowledge that they didn't have a hidden agenda and that they were really trying to help the church. One couple who had been part of the church for many years stood out as people who instilled confidence in others. They lived and breathed the church, and people knew it. As a result, their words carried incredible weight. It was also apparent during refocusing that people coalesced around two major perspectives, those who wanted to move forward and those who didn't, or at least wanted to do it slowly. I labeled these groups progressives and traditionalists, respectively. The church board, staff, and refocusing team tended to be more progressive, which certainly affected the selection and implementation of the refocusing process. Because many of the traditionalists opted out of the refocusing process or refrained from adding their voice to the discussions, the refocusing process took on a decidedly progressive bent. Yet even though the progressives dominated the refocusing process, one participant observed that the traditionalists seemed to have a shoulder up against the door that was quite powerful. This shoulder against the door became apparent after refocusing when the traditionalists were able to defeat the first lead pastor candidate that was put forth to lead the church according to the direction set out during refocusing. Now, obviously, perspective groupings are a natural part of group life. We tend to gravitate toward others of like mind. Yet during refocusing, it seemed like this gravitational pull toward either a progressive or traditional perspective became stronger. What was happening that pushed people into a particular camp, and for some even into a more extreme position with a particular camp, and made the dividing line between perspectives more distinct and divisive? At Crossroads, staff departures seemed to have a polarizing effect on the congregation. The lead pastor, who had good relationships with many in the traditionalist group, had resigned under a cloud of controversy. Some speculated that the board had pushed him out of the church because he was not progressive enough. Then, within weeks, the board recommended a refocusing process, which, even by its title, suggested that something was out of focus in the church. Change was coming. The resignation of the worship director, who embraced more of a traditional approach to worship, also sent a signal to the congregation that the church was on the cusp of significant change. Many traditionalists felt threatened by these changes and circled their wagons more tightly around their no or slow change perspective. Many progressives, on the other hand, began to feel the change momentum and got excited about what was happening. They too became more entrenched in their change position as the process continued down the change road. They didn't want to give up any perceived gains. Another factor that influenced power groups was worship service music, a powerful symbol that reflected the culture, or at least the desired culture, of the church. With the resignation of the worship director, the door opened wider for more contemporary worship expressions. Once again, this sent a signal to the congregation, a signal of hope for the progressives and a signal of doom for the traditionalists. One refocusing participant expressed this mixed signal in this way. When you walk into a worship sanctuary, you don't want your whole sense of worship culture to be challenged. The way you experience the world, and in particular, the way you talk to and listen to God. You want sanctuary, a safe haven to place your heart. Different ways of worship can be perceived as an affront, as a block to connecting with God. I've seen that happen with our seniors. It must be uncomfortable, even assaulting at times, to sit through our loud music. The language of expression is so different, so foreign. It must be quite a conundrum to try to find a safe haven to hear and express one's heart to God in the midst of this cultural clash. Another factor that influenced groupings was the healing and reconciliation that occurred during the second summit. As people openly confessed their sins and asked forgiveness, the walls between the progressives and traditionalists, or at least between individuals in each group, began to come down. I appreciate how one participant at the second summit expressed what he saw. Once somebody becomes vulnerable with you, if there is a compassion within your heart, it's going to mend whatever the rift was. It may mend it to the point that you still agree to disagree, but you'll become more understanding of the person that you are having the tension with. I believe then that that tension will diffuse itself and leave. And I think that's what happened at the second summit. I think that some people were vulnerable. Some people had compassion in their heart for them, and that diffused the tension. You see, as we build bridges of healing, reconciliation, vulnerability, and communication between divergent groups, we'll bring people closer together. In the process, polarization decreases and people become less entrenched in their position and more open to accepting others, even if their views are very different from their own. Instead of pulling in opposing directions, connected groups are more likely to find common ground and work together to achieve shared goals, while preserving at least some of their own perspectives. This kind of unity that embraces diversity can be powerful. However, it requires more than just one night of healing and reconciliation. It's really an ongoing process. Okay, so we've explored who emerged as major influencers in Crossroads' refocusing process. In the next two sessions, we'll unpack some of the implications for leaders who seek to move their groups and organizations forward to achieve their mission.